Welcome to the Tough Decisions Network. This is our special Sunday edition called Survive and Thrive with Dennae. Your host, Dennae Handford, will dive deep into chapter-by-chapter discussions on specifically selected books to help you make better decisions as an entrepreneur. Visit toughdecisions.net to sign up for our free weekly entrepreneur email. Before we get started, let's hear from one of our sponsors. Have you ever thought about investing in real estate, but find yourself so busy that you don't have time for it? Do you have FOMO, which is the fear of missing out? At HandfordCapital.com, we help investors with passive real estate investments that project better returns than traditional investment vehicles such as the stock market. If you'd like to find out more about our passive real estate investments, visit HandfordCapital.com. That's HANDFORD capital.com. We will jump on a call with you to discuss your investment goals and to see if our investments are a good fit for you. This advertisement is not to be construed as an offer or recommendation to buy or sell a security. Visit HandfordCapital.com.
Hello, and welcome to the Sunday edition of our Tough Decisions podcast. This is Dennae, and we have been spending the last couple of Sundays talking about some important topics from the book Blink, written by Malcolm Gladwell, subtitle Thinking Without Thinking. Hopefully you've learned some things about our brain's ability to process information and make quick decisions. It really is, I think you will agree, fascinating as to what our brain can actually do in processing large amounts of information very quickly. And the really important part is that this is done in most cases without our even realizing it. And so what we're going to do today and next week is hopefully bring some things together in a way that will allow us to know when we can actually trust those intuitions and those quick decisions, and when it would be better to step back and try to gather more information and analyze more information before proceeding with a decision. In Chapter 6, Gladwell deals with what he calls, and I quote here, the thin slicing of people. And so I would just ask you really quickly, how is it that we thin slice people? All right. Going back to an earlier episode, and in fact, the first episode, we talked exactly about what it is to thin slice. And this is our brain's ability of the unconscious brain to find patterns in situations and behavior based on narrow slices of experience. So how do we thin slice people, or how do we draw conclusions about people, perhaps after just a very short interaction, or maybe even no interaction at all, maybe just even looking at them? Gladwell also calls this the delicate art of mind reading. So how do we mind read? How do we look at someone else and read their mind? I ask you that a couple of different ways and give you a few seconds to think about it, because I think you'll agree that the way that we do that is by looking at their facial expressions and reading their facial expressions. I don't want to spend a lot of time going into the background that Gladwell gives, but it is fascinating. If you haven't gotten the book, I would strongly urge you to get the book, read this chapter, and think about the background, the research that he quotes. But I do want to just kind of go over it very briefly. He discusses in detail the use of facial expressions in communication. There's a wealth of studies, there's a wealth of research that's been done that shows just how much we communicate through our facial expressions. And as a side note here, I think this points out the importance of teaching our kids and our students and our followers, if you will, whether that's in business or in a classroom setting or a family setting, the importance of making eye contact and looking at someone when you're talking to them. As a former teacher and now as a parent, that's one thing that I really, really had a hard time with, is when someone would not look me in the eye when they're talking, because you can find out so much about that person by looking in their eye and looking at their face. And the same thing goes for that student, though. If they look at you in the face, they can read your facial expressions and know that maybe this talk that they're getting is not out of anger or not out of frustration, but out of a desire for you to help them. So that's kind of a side rabbit trail, if you will. But I do think it's really important that we teach young people to look at people when they're talking to them. if you're interested in this research, much of it was pioneered by two men named Sylvan Tompkins and Paul Ekman. And these men spent years cataloging the different muscle movements that go into each facial expression. So they literally studied the facial expressions in such detail that they have cataloged them into, they each have names and numbers, and they know which muscles move to create that facial expression. And then they also spent time practicing reading the facial expressions in others. And there's two takeaways that I really want to get from this, and then we'll move on. First is that everyone communicates through facial expressions. And along with that, it is a universal language. So facial expressions can be read on anyone, no matter the verbal language that they speak. And they discovered this in several different instances, but basically what they found is that, Americans could go to, Southeast Asia, African countries, and they could watch and they could read those facial expressions in the same way that they could read other Americans who spoke English the way they did. So the first takeaway, everyone communicates through facial expressions, and it's a universal language. Secondly, while everyone naturally reads other people's expressions, it is a skill that can be practiced and improved. And that's going to come into play a little bit later. Reading others' expressions is essentially mind reading. So what if you say, well, I'm not really good at mind reading, or I don't really think I'm any good at, reading people's expressions. Whether you know it, to be human is to read other people's expressions in most cases. But it is also a skill that can be practiced and improved, and that's going to be important when we come back to it a little bit later. Now, Gladwell poses another important question after that. He asks, what happens when we lose the ability to mind read? If so much information is communicated through this avenue of mind reading or thin slicing of people, what would happen if that ability were lost? And to get an idea of what would happen, we actually have to look no further than to study someone with autism, because this condition is a classic example of the inability to mind read. And if you know much about autism, you know that people with autism, they don't read social cues. They don't read other people's expressions. They don't read other people in social situations the same way everyone else does. And they essentially don't see the faces the same way the normal brain would see a face. He also points to some research that's rather interesting to back that statement up. But basically, they don't see faces the same way your average person does. It doesn't register with them in the same way. And so Gladwell argues that there are other conditions or other situations in which your, quote, normal person might lose the ability to mind read. Specifically, he's talking about particularly high stress conditions where the body's stress coping mechanisms take over. Now, again, he's getting to a point here, so bear with me. I know we're kind of talking about some different topics, but I hope to pull these all together here in just a minute. There is a range in which stress actually improves performance. Okay, this is why, high-level athletes, they are known for their ability to come through in what we would call the clutch. They have this ability to step up their performance in a stressful situation. Military commanders, military personnel, police officers, they're faced with these stressful situations on a fairly regular basis, and in a lot of cases, the stress actually improves their performance, or they're able to do things that they may not be able to do under normal conditions. Science and studies show that when the heart rate is between 115 and 145 beats per minute, the stress actually improves performance. Another good example would be performing in front of an audience or a crowd. Musicians, they have to develop an ability to use the stress or use the nervousness, sometimes we use that word, to up their performance and not let it hinder their performance. And a big part of that is being able to control their body's reactions or to regulate their reactions, to take a deep breath, to slow down their breathing, to slow down their heart rate so that then they can actually better their performance and not allow the stress to hinder them from performing at their best. But at 145 beats per minute, the body actually begins to limit itself. And 145 beats is when the body feels like it's in a life-threatening situation. So it begins to limit the range and the amount of information that it takes in. And that's a survival mechanism so that the body can focus on the threat that it's facing. And Gladwell argues that in these types of situations, that when the body begins to limit that range and amount of information that it takes in, that then its ability to thin slice or its ability to read other people's minds or thin slice people is hindered. And then we are in danger of making a really bad, perhaps catastrophic situation. He compares it to arguing with a dog. And he talks about, the fact that as humans, we have a forebrain, which is unique to humans. It's the logical thinking part of our brain. And then we have a midbrain, which is similar to that of other animals or the same as your dog. And in those really, really high stress situations, when the heart rate reaches that 145 beats per minute and above, then the midbrain basically, Gladwell says it jumps up and hijacks the forebrain. And it's like arguing. You can't argue with a dog. I mean, I have a dog and I love her dearly, but you can't argue with a dog. And the same is true, he says, of people once we reach that high level of stress, when the body is feeling like, it's being threatened in a life-threatening situation, then the midbrain takes over. And so the area of the brain where information is processed and analyzed and used to make decisions is basically non-functional at that point. And along the way here in this chapter, Gladwell does bring in several examples. He gives one particular example that was just tragic where, some police officers were on patrol one night and they came across this young man and, a couple of conclusions were drawn incorrectly. They thought that he was running from them as opposed to just stepping back into his home. They thought that he was reaching into his pant pocket for a wallet when they assumed that he was reaching into his pants pockets for a gun. But Gladwell is I think he's gracious in the way that he approaches it, because he says basically, this could happen to anybody because the situation evolves so rapidly. And once the body begins to feel threatened, and once that, heart rate and that situation reaches a certain stress level, all of us basically would have responded probably pretty much the same way. So what are the solutions? And how can we combat this? Knowing this in advance, how can we combat this? And this particular chapter, he does apply in specific to law enforcement because they are faced with these situations all the time. We don't want to be unnecessarily critical because I think we're all thankful for the job that our law enforcement do, and they're not bad people. And that's something he comes to a little bit later is, just because they make a bad decision doesn't mean they're a bad person in this situation, because in reality, these situations are so unpredictable. And once you reach that high stress level, it's hard to come back to a place of control. So some solutions that he offers, and I think these are all good for all of us, is that, we have to be able to slow down the situation. Going back to that example of a musical performer that I gave, I've never performed in front of large crowds, but I have performed or talked in, a couple of hundred people at different times. And you have to be able to control the body's reactions. You have to be able to take those deep breaths, control your breathing, control that heart rate to a certain extent, and allow your body and your brain to perform the things that they've practiced, the things that you've prepared for. One of the things that can be done, I think is important, is having protocols and a system in place. I think this is one of the really important aspects of having protocols and having a system, because of course it has to be practiced. And a lot of times what we find is in those stressful situations, the protocols and systems tend to be abandoned, but that is one thing that helps to slow down the situation. This is one reason why law enforcement is required to call for backup in certain situations, because it forces them to step back and wait. And what they have found is that when you can slow down the situation, Gladwell calls it creating white space. When that white space can be created or added, then it tends to prevent a rash, catastrophic decision. Something else that can be done as a solution is, and this may seem rather obvious, but I think it's important to state, is practice. Practice, so that the body becomes accustomed to acting deliberately even in stressful situations. And this is another thing that, our law enforcement, our military has done, I think, a good job at adding, is just putting themselves in those stressful situations before it gets to be a life-threatening situation. So practicing how you're going to respond when you're ambushed, practicing how you're going to respond when you are in a high-speed chase, and putting yourself in that position in a place where it's relatively safe. And so you can practice slowing the body down, slowing down those decisions, and acting deliberately even when the body wants to run away and derail the train, if you will. So those, I think, are some important things for each of us to think about. How can we prepare ourselves to respond in stressful situations? How can we slow down? And it's not going to be the same for everyone. You know, the stressful situations that I face are not going to be the same as the stressful situations that you face. But even in reading this and discussing this here, I've thought of different ways that I can slow down the situation. It just a kind of a silly example, but I think it still applies is, you know, we have 4 kids at home, and I'll be perfectly honest when I tell you that, you know, there's a time period in the afternoon between about 4 and 6 o'clock when things get a little crazy. And, you know, my first tendency sometimes is just to fly off the handle and scream for everybody to sit down and be quiet for about 5 minutes. But what I have learned, and only through the hard way, so I'm not setting myself on any kind of pedestal here because I've done it the wrong way, but what I have learned the hard way is that doesn't really help. That just adds to the crazy. And I have to somehow take a step back from that situation, whether it's just walking in the next room for a few minutes, taking a deep breath before I respond, or even in resisting all the urges to scream, if I can lower my voice, then that works wonders with that situation. And that is akin to slowing down the situation and acting deliberately when things want to get out of control. Practicing what you are going to do in stressful situations. One other quick example here that I was just thinking about that Gladwell mentions is, you know, dialing 911 in an emergency. We all think that's like so simple, you know, that's why they made it 911. Who's going to forget 911? But in a truly life-threatening situation, a lot of times it is forgotten. People have accidentally dialed 411. Not too long ago, someone relatively close to me was in a stressful situation, and the alarm at their home had been set off. And so there was a siren going, and, you know, the phone was ringing because the alarm company was checking in on them. And this person knew the alarm, the code to disarm the alarm. They knew it, but they kept putting it in, and the alarm wouldn't go off. And the emergency responders arrived at the home, and they were saying, we can't get the alarm to go off. There's nothing wrong, but they can't get the alarm to go off. What am I going to do? And this person told the emergency responder the alarm code. He put it in, and it went off the first time. So was it the emergency responder's magic touch? No, absolutely not. And what I would guess has happened is in that situation, the stress of the situation prevented that person from entering the alarm code properly, even though she knew the alarm code, and even though she knew enough to communicate it to another person. In that situation, she couldn't physically put in the alarm code herself. So lest you think that that's some kind of crazy, who's going to misdial 911, or, you know, if you've never been in that situation, it's something that you should practice, and that you should work on calming down those nerves and those stressful events, because you want to be able to respond properly. So some solutions to, you know, losing our ability to thin slice: slowing down the situation, following protocols, whatever it is you need to do to slow it down and create that white space so that a good decision can be made. And then practice so that you become accustomed to acting deliberately, even in a high stress situation. The good news, we can use our body's remarkable ability to react in stressful situations to our advantage, but we have to be self-aware enough to know when we may be acting too quickly. And this is where we get to the application in general of thin slicing. When can we follow those intuitions, and when should we step back and reanalyze? We have to be self-aware enough to know when we may be acting too quickly, or when we may be under too much pressure and thus be rushed into a bad, perhaps catastrophic decision. And I think it also helps to have a backup or have a partner, because we tend to balance out the propensity to overreact. And so if you have someone there who may not be in the situation with you, but when you're feeling the stress or when you're feeling the urgency, if you have someone that you can step back to, then that also helps to balance out our propensity to overreact and have another set of eyes on it that may not be quite as stressed or quite as feverish in the way that they're looking at the situation and help us in making a decision. Next week, we're going to wrap up our discussion of the topics from this book, Blink, Thinking Without Thinking. And I hope to be able to share a few more applications with you and try to help us understand when we should trust and when we can trust our unconscious decisions or our intuition, and when we should look for more information before proceeding and going forward with a rash decision that might be harmful to ourselves or others.
Thank you for listening to the Tough Decisions Network. Be sure to visit toughdecisions.net to gain access to show notes for this episode and to join our free weekly entrepreneur email where we will send you news about the latest technology for your business, inspiring quotes, and the latest books for entrepreneurs. That's toughdecisions.net.